Pete Best really despised him more than anyone else. Randolph Peter Best was born on November 24, 1941. As Pete Best, his father worked as a naval engineer in Madras, British India, during World War II. His mother, Mona Best, was a strong and ambitious woman who would eventually be very important to the Beatles' early success. After the war, the Best family moved to Liverpool, England. Mona started the Casbah Coffee Club in the basement of their home on Hayman's Green. This modest place would become a very important place for many young artists in the late 1950s and early 1960s, including a group of local teens who would soon impact music history forever. Pete grew up in Liverpool, a city that was full of rhythm, ambition, and the vitality of post-war life. Early rock and roll music made the city throb. In this creative setting, Pete's passion in music grew naturally. While he was in college grammar school, he started to like percussion and often played around with homemade drum kits. His calm, gloomy behavior was very different from the more showy people around him, but his strong will and calm demeanor set him apart. Teenagers John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison were in a band named the Quarrymen in 1959. They played at the Casbah Club a lot. They later decided to be a full-time rock and roll band and changed their name to the Silver Beatles and then the Beatles. They needed a permanent drummer. It seemed clear that Pete Best was the best choice. In August 1960, Pete officially joined the Beatles. This made the roster that would go on the band's first arduous tour in Hamburg, Germany. People still talk about the Beatles' stay in Hamburg. Weeks of concerts that lasted all night and changed their style, endurance, and musical chemistry. During these early days, Pete's strong drumming helped shape the band's sound. People in Hamburg were drawn to his appearance and the way he moved to the beat. His serious look and thick, dark hair made him a heartthrob for many female fans. Musically, he gave the Beatles the raw beat that got them through long sessions, which earned him admiration from his bandmates, at least for a while. But by 1962, things started to get tense. After auditioning the band, producer George Martin is said to have been unhappy with Pete's drumming and recommended utilizing a session drummer for recordings. This, together with personal problems in the group, led to one of the most well-known decisions in music history. On August 16, 1962, manager Brian Epstein took Pete into his office and told him that another drummer, Ringo Starr, would be taking his place. Pete was heartbroken when he got fired. He had been with the band through their hardest early years, helping them improve their stage performance and get their first big breaks, but just as they were about to become famous all across the world, he was left behind. After that, Pete Best went through years of intense emotional pain. He stayed out of the public eye for a while because he was depressed and disillusioned, but he slowly put his life back together with quiet grace. He started other bands, like the Pete Best Band, but later stopped doing music and worked for the government for a long time. Some people could have been bitter about their situation, but Pete took it with amazing grace. He married Cathy and had 2 daughters with her. They had a fairly private life in Liverpool. The stigma of being the man who was almost a bug changed over time into a badge of honor. Fans started to think of Pete not as a forgotten person, but as an important part of the Beatles' history. The Beatles Anthology, which came out in 1995, was a huge event in both music history and Pete Best's life. Best has lived in the shadow of the Beatles' incredible stardom for more than 30 years. He was kicked out of the band shortly before they became famous all over the world. The Anthology project was a TV documentary, a series of LPs, and a thorough book that looked back at the band's early days. It also included some of their initial recordings recorded before Ringo Starr joined. Some of these were early demo tunes that Pete Best played drums on at Abbey Road Studios and Decca Records. Best was legally entitled to royalties when these recordings were officially released as part of the Beatles Anthology 1 because his performances were featured. For the first time since he left the band in 1962, he got a lot of money for his work in the band's early years. This moment had a lot of meaning. Not only did it give Best overdue credit for his part in crafting the early Beatles sound, but it also gave him some closure and redemption after years of being seen as the man who lost out on history. Fans all over the world were happy about this change of events, seeing it as justice for a singer who had been in the dark and the subject of speculation for decades. Best later said that the royalties made him feel better financially and emotionally since they proved that his place in Beatles history was real and could never be erased. Pete Best became even more famous in 2008 when he released his own album, Hayman's Green, which critics surprisingly liked. The album, which was ascribed to the Pete Best Band, had a mix of rock songs with a modern feel and hints of 1960 seconds music, which was a clear nod to the time when Best originally made his mark. The title of the album was a nod to Hayman's Green, the Liverpool neighborhood where the Casbah Coffee Club used to be. It was the spot where Mona Best, Hayman's mother, started the club and where the Beatles played their first shows. Rogue Best, his younger brother, played drums and helped produce the record. It was a family affair. Critics said that Hayman's Green showed not just how mature Pete's music was, but also how he thought about the long and winding road his life had traveled since he left the Beatles. Songs like Come With Me and Dream Me Home showed that Pete Best was more than simply the man before Ringo. They showed that he was a good musician and had emotional depth. The record gave him back his identity as an artist on his own terms, separate from the Beatles' heritage but always tied to it. Pete Best's love story with Cathy started in 1962, which was one of the most exciting and life-changing events of his life. It was at a Beatles party at the famous Cavern Club in Liverpool, a smoky, pulsing subterranean club that had become the center of the Muri beat scene, where fate brought them together. The cavern was full of excitement that night, with the sound of rock and roll and the laughing of young dreamers who had no idea how much history was being made around them. In the midst of the flashing lights, swaying bodies, and seductive music, Pete saw a young woman whose happy energy and natural grace stuck out to him. Cathy, who worked at the Woolworth shop in town, was dancing cheerfully and freely, lost in the moment. Pete, who had just left the Beatles and was still dealing with a lot of emotions, was drawn to her warmth and genuine grin. Pete couldn't stop looking at her as the night wore on. Cathy was honest and down to earth, which was a nice change from the craziness of fame and the uncertainties of his career at the moment. He gathered his bravery and went up to her. They started to converse over the music and laughter. Their discussion flowed easily, with jokes, questions, and the feeling of instant connection. Pete later said that it wasn't just her looks that attracted him. It was also her friendliness and down-to-earth character, things that made him feel like more than just the famous person. Like the former Beatles drummer, Pete had been heartbroken when he was kicked out of the band he helped build. Cathy was a source of comfort, understanding, and a new beginning for him. Their relationship grew swiftly based on real love and respect for each other instead of the glitter of fame. Cathy was helpful and down to earth, which helped Pete get back on his feet and start over with his life and music career. She was there for him at times of reflection and change, helping him get his confidence and sense of purpose back after the crazy early years of the Beatles. Pete and Cathy got married in 1963, a year after they first met. The ceremony was simple but sincere, and it showed how much they cared about family, love, and resilience over fame and fortune. The couple's closeness lasted, showing how deeply they cared for each other and how determined they were to have a meaningful life away from the spotlight. Pete and Cathy worked together to make a home that was stable and full of love. They would have 2 children, both of whom would become very important to Pete. Family life gave him a sense of calm and belonging that stardom never did. Pete often said that Cathy was his rock, the person who helped him get over one of the most public professional failures in music history and find happiness again. Pete chose to look ahead instead of being resentful or nostalgic. He dedicated himself to his family and music on his own terms. Cathy's quiet strength and loyalty helped him keep that good attitude. People frequently feel nostalgic when they reminisce about the early days of the Beatles. 4 young men from Liverpool who wanted to change the course of music history. But behind that shining reputation was a tempest of personal stress, hurt feelings, and treachery. For Pete Best, the band's first drummer, the worst thing that ever happened to him wasn't losing stardom, but Paul McCartney, the guy he thought had done him the most damage. Best never covered how he felt about McCartney, and throughout the years, he spoke so honestly that it showed how deep his anger was. People routinely asked Pete Best about his relationship with the other Beatles, especially John Lennon, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney, in interviews. When Paul came up, his tone would shift a much. Paul was the one I had the hardest time forgiving, Pete once said. That one sentence held decades of anger, animosity that came from what Best viewed as McCartney's subtle ambition and calculating personality, which he disguised behind his courteous smile. Pete said that he and Paul were never really close in the beginning. We were never friends like John and I were. He said that Paul seemed nice enough, but there was always something about him that made him seem distant, like he was sizing everyone up. In 1960, Pete Best joined the Beatles, who were still just another struggling band from Liverpool trying to create a name for themselves in the smoky bars of Hamburg. He was the one who gave them a strong beat and helped them secure their first steady jobs. People adored him for his moody good looks, and he became a kind of a local heartthrob. Pete said that Paul McCartney didn't like that. Pete said he could feel it. Paul didn't appreciate that some of the girls in the audience were staring at me instead of him. It seems small today, but jealousy can ruin friendships when you're young. They also have different tastes in music. McCartney was a perfectionist who cared a lot about harmony and accuracy. Pete, on the other hand, had a rougher, more natural approach that worked well with the raw intensity of their early shows. Pete remembered, Paul wanted everything to be perfect, but back then, the Beatles weren't about being polished. We were all about power. He would silently talk bad about my drumming behind my back instead of directly telling me what he thought. Later, I found out that he was one of the people that wanted George Martin to fire me. Pete never really forgave McCartney for telling him that he had a part in his firing. In August 1962, just before the Beatles recorded their debut single for Emmy, Pete Best was suddenly let go. He was heartbroken. He recalled years later, "It wasn't just losing the band. I thought I had brothers, but they were gone. And out of all of them, Paul seemed like the one who genuinely wanted me to leave." Manager Brian Epstein's official version was vague. George Martin didn't think Pete's drumming was good enough. But over time, rumors came out that said personal problems inside the band were just as important. Pete always thought that Paul was at the heart of that fight. Paul wanted to do a lot, maybe more than any of us. He thought the Beatles were perfect, and in his mind, I didn't fit that picture. Pete went into a profound despair after Ringo Starr took his place. He had a hard time finding jobs and even thought about quitting music altogether. At the same time, the Beatles became superstars. Watching them on TV after that was torture. Pete added, "When I saw Paul smile and joke, it felt like a stab in the gut. He had everything I had lost: fame, money, and the band I helped make." That anger grew for years. Pete said that he could never forget how things ended, even if he eventually found serenity and made a quiet life for himself. He added in a later interview, "Time heals a lot of things, but not that. Paul and I were never pals. I don't think we could ever be." Even after many years, Pete Best's words regarding McCartney stayed very much the same. He drew a clear line with Paul even when he complimented John Lennon's inventiveness or George Harrison's generosity. John was crazy. He stated George was thoughtful, but Paul was the one who always had to be in charge. That's who he was then, and that's who he is now. It wasn't just hate. It was a mix of pain and distrust that wouldn't go away. Pete said that he respected what McCartney did, but he could never forget what he lost. Pete said, "I can't deny he's a genius, but geniuses can be cruel, and Paul was cruel to me." Pete Best's narrative and how he felt about Paul McCartney are now one of rock history's most painful stories. The man who almost had it all is heartbroken, and he is angry with the friend who, in his mind, made sure he didn't.